Everyone. We are so glad that you are here joining us today. Welcome to our Facebook viewers and to our people that have signed in to the webinar. Tonight, we have a treat with Dr. Karen Henery, and we are just so ecstatic that she's coming to speak to us about English learners and giftedness. As you know, AGAT is an organization that encourages the development of and implementation of educational programs and initiatives throughout the state, especially when it comes to serving and identifying the gifted and talented youth of Arkansas. And we know that we want to learn more about serving our gifted and talented youth, no matter what ethnic background. So we're going to really tune in and hear about ESL tonight. And please just sit back. If you have any questions, just go ahead and enter it into the Q&A. And please talk to us on the chat and on the Facebook comments, and we will share your questions. All right, take it away, Dr. Henery. She is an employee of Little Rock School District, my colleague. All right.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that lovely introduction, and welcome everyone who's viewing from wherever you are. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to speak to you tonight about what is my passion and my love in education. I am in my 24th year as an educator in Arkansas, and I love and embrace the work that I do as the director of the English for Speakers of Other Languages program. And tonight to have the opportunity to speak to you about giftedness among English learners. I personally believe that if you are able to communicate in more than one language, you're certainly on the tip of having a gifted streak in you, because it's not easy. And if there's some of you on this webinar or on Facebook Live and you are multilingual or bilingual, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not, I have much respect for people who can function in more than one language, because I know lots of neurons have to fire to get those prompts received and responses generated. So I'm going to start by just talking a little bit about what does it mean to be gifted and talented. And I just gave you what I felt was my version of somebody being gifted and talented, some research to see what the official definitions are. And among the information that I found, this was something from the National Association for Gifted Children. And their definition reads somewhere along the lines of children with abilities that are significantly above the norm in some areas are considered to be gifted. And if you're gifted and talented, it means you have academic or creative abilities that are above the norm. So we could look at some traditional pieces, but the creative pieces are what I think, drive my engine in terms of saying, yes, this child is potentially gifted. So gifted and talented children may also perform above the norm in creative, artistic, intellectual, or leadership domains, or specific academic subjects such as math, science, or language arts. So there's a breadth and depth of possibility of identifying a gifted student. It's not just about, is this student performing? And when we start to think about English learners, it's not just an exclusive club for students who are proficient in English, because as you can see, and as you well know, those of you who work in gifted education, gifts appear in many different milieu in terms of what a child can do and how a child can demonstrate what those gifts are. So I think it's an exciting opportunity for educators to have the option of looking at what students are gifted in and what those gifts are and how we can elicit those responses where they get to demonstrate their talents and their gifts. So I wanted to give you a little background for who our English learners are in this wonderful state of Arkansas. And just a little bit about my work with English learners. I've been working with our ESL program since its inception in terms of developing out our program, starting in 1999, where we had a very low number of students. And presently we are close to 3,000 students. And I'll talk a little bit about how our demographic has shifted this year, which I'm sure a lot of districts have experienced shift in those numbers because of the current pandemic and some of our student numbers just falling off. But this graphic that I'm displaying shows what has happened in Arkansas and to different parts of Arkansas in terms of English learners over time. And it goes back to the 2004-2005 school year, where, as you can see, the Northeast is in green, the Southeast is the blue line, the gray line is the Central Arkansas line, which is where my school district is located. Then there's the yellow line for the Southwest, and the red line is the Arkansas overall picture, and the broken orange line is the Northwest Arkansas. And the US average added blue line. I hope you can see those colors. But just note that the very top line, that's Northwest Arkansas. And traditionally, Northwest Arkansas has always had more English learners than any other part of the state. And there's a little, well, it's not a secret, but there's some information that will help you understand some of the population surges there. You've got industry as well as Marshallese people who traditionally have settled in very few places in the United States, and they've primarily settled in and around Northwest Arkansas. And if you ever have the chance to read what that story is about, it's a fascinating story of how the Marshallese people came to the United States and live here legally and work and educate, we help to educate their children. So I learned about it after I'd been in my role, reading an article one Sunday, and I thought it was a very fascinating piece about immigration, because that's what has really driven the needle on increasing our numbers of students. Arkansas might have a smaller percentage of English learners than the national average, but between 2004 and 2005 through to 2018-19, we doubled the percentage of English learners we had relative to national numbers. And that steep increase was really centered around the Northwest. I think it's Sebastian, Benton, and Carroll County experiencing an explosion in numbers. However, Central and Southwest regions have also seen some steep increases. And I think, and I know from my own experience within the Little Rock School District, we started to do a better job of identifying our students, because identification is a huge part of knowing who your English learners are. And I have a familiar phrase that I say, what's in a name? And by that I mean, it doesn't matter what a student's name is. That's not an indicator of their language minority status or that they come from a language background other than English. And every day I'm proven right in that supposition, because you can't look at a student's name to determine, well, this student might speak Spanish at home, or this student might speak Chinese at home, or another language. That's never an indicator. It might be a clue, but it's not an official means of identifying students and saying who could be an English learner. And I'll talk a little bit about what that process looks like. So how are English learners identified? The process begins with the administration of what is known as a home language usage survey. And that survey asks very specific questions about the types of language the student is exposed to at home, the language the student first learned to speak, the language the parents speak to the student, the language the parents speak to each other, and so on and so forth. And it's administered upon initial enrollment in any public school or district in Arkansas. And by that I mean public schools as well as charter schools, which are publicly funded, are required to administer this assessment. It's not required in private schools because they don't fall under public school guidelines. And the goal is to administer it once and to record those responses on a document that is provided by the Arkansas Department of Education, because we have to report numbers officially each fall. So based on this, that the family gives for the student, a school district or a school is responsible to administer a screener for language. It's only administered in English, and that screener is a baseline to ascertain what the student is able to do in that moment in the domains of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. There are 4 language domains that they're assessed in. The results of the screener will determine whether or not the student is identified and placed as an English learner, or whether the student is identified and placed as a fluent English proficient student, with some specifications on how we treat that student. So in the event that a student is identified as an English learner, that student is recommended for placement in an ESL program that a school district or school provides. And those processes are not a one-person decision-making piece. Schools are required to have what is known as a language proficiency assessment, which is otherwise known as an LPAC. And when that LPAC meets, they are to review the results of that language assessment and ascertain, okay, the student is speaking at a level 5, listening at a level 4, reading and writing at a level 1 for those domains. So the scale on the assessment goes from 1 through 5, with 5 being the highest and 1 being the lowest. I will honestly say to you that many of our students arrive all at level 1, where they're listening, speaking, reading, and writing as level 1 students. Well, that's that moment in time. That's not forever. Being an English learner is never intended to be your forever status, because we expect our students to grow. And there are things that we do to help our students grow. So once schools have followed those guidelines and timelines, because this has to be a timely process of identifying students and communicate with parents what is happening with this child in terms of the educational processes, then we're good to go. Practices around this process are fairly standardized because it's an online instrument. It's not subject to whether I like a student or don't like a student, or this child is just lovely. They're all lovely kids. Children are lovely in everybody's and their parents' eyes. And the scoring is also standardized. So the scoring is not subject to the decision of someone over here who says, well, I like how this child wrote. Has nothing to do with anything. So this is a really improved process where it's very objective, and there's not the subjectivity of an individual making a decision. There's a group of people who make a decision based on those results, but there's also a scoring rubric that says if a student scores this way, the student is not proficient. The student is either at a beginner level, a progressing level, or a proficient level. And as a district or school, we have to make determinations on how we place our students for services. But let me also say this, grade placement is not determined through this assessment. So a student is not placed in first grade or in 7th grade based on how they perform on this language assessment, nor is this language assessment used to deny a student access to a specific type of program or services because, well, you're an English learner, so you can't possibly be gifted, or you can't possibly need additional educational supports. And we're going to talk a bit about those extra pieces. The results of the assessment are available to parents, should be provided to parents, as well as the educators who support students. And it's not a secret how students perform. We want parents to know so that they can understand what we're trying to do with their students and how we need them to support the activities that are taking place while students are at school. Not all of our gifted students are the same. And I know I'm probably preaching to the choir, because you can have the student who is like your typical type 1, who is going to be the successful one. Then you've got the one who is, going to be a little divergent and not necessarily getting to the end result the same way. And then you're going to have another one who is, totally underground in terms of what they're doing. We're going to have some kids who are going to be dropouts. They're going to drop out on this because, this is just not appealing to me. I'm gifted, but I'm not, it's not really hitting the mark for me. And I heard a minute ago, ones who were double labeled. I'm gifted, but I also have some additional exceptionalities. And then there's that student who is just that autonomous learner who can just do it all, probably could teach our classes. So All of our gifted students are not going to present with all the same gifts and graces. And that's something that I think as an educator has influenced me in my thinking about children, is that they all come with different gifts and graces. And my job as an educator is to maximize the gift that the student brings and meet those educational goals that are set for kids. So that's how I try to philosophize the differences among students. Something that, kind of plagues my mind is, if I speak more than one language, is that a gift? Is that truly a gift that I have if I can speak and communicate in more than one language? And I just want you guys to think about that for a second. Um, if you have a student who speaks or communicates in another language, and I'm not even asking about how proficient it is that student gifted? And on some level, I think, depending on how far they can take it, I think that's a gift, because you've got an additional skill set and you're able to demonstrate communicative competence in another language. And I have a deep respect for people who communicate in more than one language. Some of the myths about gifted students. Gifted students are role models in non-accelerated classrooms. Therefore, they should not be asked to participate in accelerated learning programs. So we really need to plant our gifted students so that they can be the role models. Well, I don't know that that is fair, because I think of it, especially with English learners, when we think of a peer system, a buddy system. Sometimes a buddy system is great, but if I'm the buddy who has to tell my peer who is not efficient in English how to do everything, I don't want to be your teacher. I want to be the student who's in there learning just as you are learning, and I don't want to be the role model for you. So sometimes we have to weigh and balance how appropriate that would be. Many gifted students, another myth, many gifted students receive poor grades because they're unengaged in slower paced learning. They just mask their abilities to fit in socially. I don't know that I think that's something that is easy to say, well, they're just faking it. They don't want us to know just how good they are, because they just don't want to fit in socially. That's not necessarily the truth for our kids. And this last one, you may agree or disagree. So, and I say some school districts see advanced placement programs as gifted education. These programs prepare students for college, but they don't necessarily meet the criteria for education meeting the needs of educationally defined gifted and talented students. So just because we have AP classes, does that mean that we're providing gifted education for our students? And I'll talk a little bit about a young lady at the very end, and you'll see how she got into her AP classes. Now, our English learners in the Little Rock School District, just a few demographic bits and pieces. They represent approximately 8% of our district enrollment. And as I shared with you earlier, many districts, including mine, have seen a slight downturn in the numbers of students that we've had this year because of the current pandemic, and a lot of fear and concern in our community in terms of, should I even send my kids to school? Or sometimes families have had to move because of economic circumstances where there's job loss and they have to move somewhere else. So we've lost some students. I wouldn't say we've lost thousands, but we've lost some students. And among that group of students, 6.4% of them are in the gifted program, which is just slightly below where our overall district enrollment for gifted students looks like. And the one thing that I do want to say is that English learner status is not permanent. Reclassification is a goal. And by reclassification means that our students are meeting the criteria set out by the Department of Education, Division of Elementary and Secondary Education, and they put some very specific criteria out there that are not anybody's subjective opinion. It really speaks to if our students are demonstrating proficiency in ELPA 21, which is the English Language Proficiency Assessment. We're currently in the assessment phase for that annual assessment. And if the students are meeting the criteria on that assessment for proficiency, along with additional pieces of evidence. And I can't recite them all, but some of them include results from our standardized assessments that all students will participate in, along with grades are not part of the process, along with any additional, for example, NWEA assessments, as well as ACT interim assessments. My district does not use those, but that is used by some districts across the state. So there are additional pieces that can be used to support reclassification. And if you know anything in the world of ESL, the research says it can take anywhere from 7 to 10 years for a student to become proficient. So proficiency is a process. Being an English learner is not a permanent state of affairs. And once students are formerly English learners, they have to be monitored for 4 years. Many of the students who are in the overall group of gifted students are former English learners. So I'm very proud of the fact that the way that we identify students and place them in gifted programs is not something that excludes English learners. Because when I looked at the numbers today, and I'll share those on my next slide, I was impressed to see how many kids who are still within 4 years of being monitored, and they were English learners within the last 4 years. So as you can see, currently, there are 178 students who are still English learners who are also identified as gifted. The 217 number, those are kids who were identified within the last 4 years. And that means that they met the criteria the state has established for us in reclassifying students. Then there's another group who were reclassified more than 4 years ago, and there are 57 of them. So the way this works is within a 4-year period, we have to monitor students. So next year, that 57 number will rise because some of the 217 will be out of 4 years. And every successive year, it will continue to rise. Some of these students may eventually be, some of them might be in high school right now, and they may be graduated by them. So the numbers will remain fluid. The next number below that, 54, those are students who arrived in our district and they come from a language background other than English. And when we screened them, they were screened as proficient. I still have to consider all language minority students, whether they are proficient or on their way to proficiency, because there's always the culture to be taken into consideration, the language background, those pieces that students bring into school that we have to take into consideration in terms of how we treat our students. So we want to be respectful of every part of a student, and just because you come from a background where a language other than English is utilized doesn't mean that we give you any less regard than a student who is just a native speaker and English is the only language in their life. So the total size of the group for all of our language minority students is 506 students. And I think that's a very healthy number to have in terms of the kids who are in this group. And of course, we're always looking for ways to be as inclusive as we can be, because of course it's about making sure that we are tapping into the gifts and the attributes of our students. How did we get to this point? Being able to tap into looking at kids who come with very diverse gifts and graces, along with language. And I think it starts with eliminating, the bias that we have as instructors, where we might think, well, this kid is an English learner, and we're just not going to see some traditionally high performance. If we're thinking about it from the perspective of what can this child communicate to me about what their gift is or what they're proficient in, and it might not be, they may not be able to tell you in language how they're arriving at an answer or what their thinking is. But we have to have assessments that allow students to express themselves in diverse ways that are not necessarily conventional, where we're relying on assessment data and looking at previous high achievement. And language and culture should not really influence our decisions. So those are some of the things that several years ago, I had many conversations with colleagues on my end to really talk about, okay, who are these students and how do they fit into the big picture of looking at what is gifted or what is an indication of a student being gifted. So I think we've come a long way in terms of the lens that we put on this conversation and on these activities for students. And I'm proud to see that this has evolved over time. And some of the things that would help in the process is looking at what are some of the alternative expressions that might say, hey, we might want to screen this kid for giftedness. And here are a few examples. If a student is acquiring their second or third language at a fairly rapid rate, we might want to say, let's see if this child fits the profile and do a screening on the student. And I think of some examples of students that I experienced or I interacted with directly, and how I saw those students soar over time. And when I think now of how they presented initially, and I think that kid has got to be gifted, because if you arrive as a seventh grader, you speak no English, you speak German, you speak Mandarin because that's the language of your home, and you were learning Latin in Germany. The potential is there for this student to acquire. That student in particular was acquiring a fourth language very rapidly. He did. And I remember sitting at a graduation many, many years later and watching this tall, lanky student walk up to the podium and be introduced as the student who was a salutatorian, and he was on his way to MIT. This was several years ago. And my jaw dropped. I was like, oh, that's that kid that I met who didn't even know how to say hello, my name is, when I met him. And he stood and spoke, and it was so eloquent. And I was so proud of the fact that he was a product of our district. He had acquired the language he needed to be so successful, and he had been there less than 10 years because he came in as a seventh grader. And there's no way I could have looked at him on the day when he showed up in my office and I tried to talk to him, and his dad was speaking to me and he didn't say anything. There was no way I could have fathomed that he would have been where he was when I saw him making his exit and headed to MIT. And he's probably discovering some fabulous thing right now because he just was that type of student. Code switching ability. When you see or you hear students doing this, and code switching is when a student is able to alternate between two or more languages or varieties of language in a conversation. And if you've ever heard someone do it, it's surreal on one level, because you think, well, how are they thinking in English and Spanish at the same time? And they say certain words and it's in English, and then some of the conversation is in Spanish, and they're going back and forth. And so I asked someone one day, a colleague of mine, because we were in the same space and I wasn't listening to her conversation, but I could tell that this conversation was going back and forth. She would start saying something in English, and then all of a sudden she would move into Spanish. And I asked her and I said, how do you know when to switch? She said, I don't. I just switch. And I thought that was interesting. So she was saying to me, I'm not making a conscious decision. It's just my thinking. Whatever I'm thinking about in that moment that allows me to switch back and forth. So that would be something that you may not see among younger students, but you might see it among older students who have had more time to develop that first language that they're learning or that they've learned at home. And they're able to go back and forth and back and forth. And sometimes you might see that conversation when they're talking to their parents. Another pointer could be the students who have comfort and ease navigating the different cultures, and they're not shy or they're not unwilling to jump in and try something just as easily over here versus over there. I can think of another student that he volunteered in one of my summer programs, played soccer all his life. That's what he knew. But guess what? he was the kicker for his school's football team, and proud of the fact that he could play football as well as play soccer. Not something that he traditionally would have done, but his parents were very supportive because, his parents wanted him to experience what other students are experiencing and what other parents are interested in for their kids, no differently. Another example is students who can think of ways to lead, not necessarily because I'm the student council president, but maybe I can think of something that I can do as a student that helps others, or students who have amazingly large imaginations and can come up with wackiest things, and you're thinking, wow, why didn't I think of that? I'm the teacher. Another area to look at potentially is if a student has high reading level ability in their first language. And sometimes we have to dig a little deeply for this. And that is, it's pretty much aligned to Arkansas as an English only instruction state. So we don't use any instruments that assess a student in their native language. But if you're working with a student and you can sense, or you can provide the student with a bilingual book, there's nothing illegal about that. And if that student is devouring the material, but they can't quite tell you what it is, that might be the opportunity to say, you know what, if there's someone who's bilingual, who's an adult, I would love to know what this child is reading and able to understand from this material, because that could be a sign that this child is ahead for their age and their grade level, and they're reading at a high level. Well, they're going to be able to transfer those skills into English. Mature family leadership at an early age. Sometimes we'll see our kids who know way more than a child that's their age peer because they've had to help their parents. So that child might know how to balance a checkbook. They may understand the process of paying bills. They may have to read certain documents to their parents, and they're typically leading a lot of what is going on at home. Let me say this very clearly. As educators, we cannot rely on students to be their family's interpreters or translators. However, if a student says to you, yeah, last night I was doing this and this for my mom or for my dad, and I know I have friends who grew up with parents who didn't speak English, and they'll say things to me like, yeah, I used to write the rent check every month, or I had to write my dad's car note every month because my dad didn't read or write in English, and I had to balance his checkbook, and I knew all the finances of the family. Realistically, how many of our personal children know our family finances? They don't, because we don't engage our children in those activities to know how to balance our checkbooks. And another indicator could be problem solving ability. If that student is highly creative and has got a lot of outside of the box thinking, that might be the kid to say, you know what, let's dig a little deeper and see if this student fits the criteria for giftedness. So you'll see that in this list here, I haven't said anything about achievement data on any levels of academic proficiency. So these are some of the outside of the academic assessments that we could look at. Another way in which we can have a different lens when we're looking at our students is to be culturally responsive. And that's really to have that ability to learn from and relate respectfully with people of our own culture, as well as those from other cultures. I am someone who's from another culture. I've been an immigrant twice over. I started my life in Guyana in South America. I did not learn any Spanish there. Well, I learned Spanish in high school there, but it wasn't a lot. And then I immigrated to Canada. And I lived in Canada for 20 years before I immigrated to the United States. So I've learned a lot and had to learn a lot about culture in moving from one country to the next. And I'm very curious about culture and people, and I try to be respectful of differences because my culture is different from Jennifer's culture, because Jennifer grew up in the South and I grew up in between Guyana in South America and Canada in North America. So while Jennifer Thomas and I might look physically similar, I may have similar racial ancestry, culturally, we're going to have some differences and we're going to have some similarities. Does it mean that Jennifer's culture is better than mine or mine is better than hers? No, it just means we're different. And so I think we can be culturally responsive if we take the time to learn and respect other people's culture just the way we want ours to be respected. And I'm big on, making sure that we teach our teachers in our district about the cultural aspect of the lives of our students, because if you don't know where your students are coming from, then it's really difficult to make those connections, and you might overlook or miss some of those important pieces. And that specific definition came from the National Center for Culturally Responsive Educational Systems. Another idea around culturally responsive teaching is that it focuses on perceived strengths of students and having that liaison where you're able to address what is happening at home, what's happening at school, and sometimes there's a disconnect because the home culture and the school culture is not necessarily the same. And for the student, they've got to navigate both. So we always have to serve as that bridge that helps that child to be able to say, okay, these are my strengths. And when I'm at home, this is what is expected of me at home. And when I'm at school, this is what is expected of me at school. And my teacher is that middle person who is able to serve as that liaison between home and school. Within a definition, there's also another explanation that culturally responsive teaching is a systematic approach to modern day teaching by taking into consideration all those different aspects of culture and its values. And I can't say this hard enough, that we spend a lot of time working with our teachers and teaching them about how to navigate cultural differences among their students within a classroom. And one of the things we've done over the years, and I think we've done it fairly successfully, is we schedule one of our training days is a half-day scavenger hunt day. And we send them with clues to look for places in the community. And those places are typically places where they can experience a culture that is not necessarily their own. Some of the things we've done in the past, we haven't done anything in this recent year because of the pandemic and the limitations that we have in terms of where we can go and what we can do. But however, that's a change. Change is coming. But we've gone, and I've actually been on that particular scavenger hunt where we went to visit a place in Southwest Little Rock where tortillas were being made. And that was important because, as it turned out, one of the teachers who was on the tour, she recognized a parent. And for that parent, that was like, oh my gosh, like, wow, there's my child's teacher. All she could say was teacher, teacher. And the teacher looked at her and she said, hi, you're so-and-so's mom. Now, whether the parent got all of what the teacher said was not what was important. But what was important that the teacher could see the parent at work, and the parent could see that the teacher gave a care to be with a group of educators who all went on this tour. And we usually ask ahead of time if we can show up, and, we'll have a group of 10, 15, or maybe 20 people, or we'll break them into two groups to not make it too overwhelming. And that was one of the places we went to. And it was just such a heartwarming feeling because that teacher and parent connected over just seeing this parent at work. Some of the other places we've taken our teachers to include going to one of our Latino grocery stores, because that's where our kids shop. And if we don't know where our kids go, then we're missing that connection to see, oh, there's a meat counter. They get to pick the pieces of meat that they want. They may not be at Kroger where everything is packaged, or Whole Foods standing at that meat counter, but it's not much different from the one at, whether it's La Regional or Sin Fronteras. But this is where our kids are shopping, and for kids it's exciting to see their teacher. If they see their teacher, I've had that experience with kids that we have in our summer programs, and if I go out, I'm at Walmart or wherever, and I see a kid from the summer program, I'll be, hey, and I could see the parent looking at me like, how do you know my kid? And then I'll stop and say who I am. And the kid will explain, oh, this is so-and-so from Camp Camdu or whatever. And then the parent will smile. But those are connections you have to make. That helps you to become more culturally responsive as an educator. We also go to some of our Asian supermarkets because not all of our students are Latino. We also have some students who are Asian. And it's a cultural experience. It's a field trip. It's where you get to go and take in the smells and the sights and the sounds of everything that is different from what your experiences are. And it's eye-opening. It's eye-opening. That's the day where we get the biggest teacher response when we do our surveys. And the responses are, man, I never knew this. I wish I had known this. I wish I had been here. I didn't know what was in this store. I drive past it every day. I'm going to stop here and pick up tortillas or whatever. So that's one of the ways that we have dug into awakening that cultural response among our teachers. And I think it has served us well over the years to be able to and to provide that opportunity for educators. Why learn a language? Well, I think it's about everything. It's empowering. You can understand other people. You can maybe have better job opportunities. You have an awareness of differences as well as commonalities. Travel when we can travel again. Just having that exposure, building those memories, having the confidence to say something to your students. When you can say something in a student's language, that student just walks a little taller because it's like, oh, wow, my teacher knows how to say hello, or my teacher said hello to my mom in my language. And just think of how much more that student is able to demonstrate about what they know because they know that you know about me. You care about me, you know something about my life. Some of my closing thoughts are, and this is a quote from a colleague, friend who became a friend. She worked with me for 10 years. And she always used to say, just because I cannot speak does not mean I cannot think. And it's always resonated in my brain, like, what do you mean? What does that mean? And the way she put it was, students are sometimes overlooked because they can't communicate. And it doesn't mean that they don't have a lot of thoughts going on in their heads and that they're not bright and brilliant and gifted and talented and super, engaged in what's happening, but they just can't tell you what's going on. And today, that person, whose name is Lupe Pena de Martinez, she's a principal of East End Middle School in the Sheridan School District. And that position is one she assumed for the 2019-2020 school year. But Lupe arrived in the Little Rock School District by way of California. Her parents had a third grade education, both of them. They were not highly educated people, but they valued education and they saw in her the potential. She came here as a high school student, and she explained that how she got into AP classes was one day she was in a regular class and they were asked to write a piece, and then she was called on to read her piece. And she said she read it, and the kids laughed when she was done. She was embarrassed. She was like, oh gosh, like, what did I read? And the teacher admonished them and said, stop. And the teacher said to her, you don't need to be in this class. You need to be in a more challenging class because your writing is amazing. And afterwards, one of the students said, yeah, we laughed because we didn't know that you could speak English. Because she was in class, she was sitting there quietly, minding her own business, soaking it all in. So sometimes, just sometimes, we have to dig a little deeper with our students just to determine what it is that they know and use some of those non-traditional pieces. And, I don't know that today that a teacher would ask a student to write something and read it out loud, because that might be a practice we don't use today. But had that not happened for her, no one would have known what she knew. And she's in her, I think, 19, 20, 21. She's, going into her third year of being a principal at the East End Middle School. And from all accounts, loving job and loving her life. She did start as a teacher in Little Rock and moved on to assistant principal. And, you know, I'm proud to say that I was associated with her for many years because we worked together, and I learned a lot from her about culture and language and a lot about the Latino community. So I was fortunate to have the opportunity to work with someone who grew up as an English learner and had opportunities because of teachers and educators who would take the time to focus on what she needed. You know, I could tell you lots of stories about her life, but I don't want to use all of our time. You know, about when a teacher saw her reading in California, reading a book in Spanish, and the teacher looked at her and said, "You could read?" And she just looked at the teacher and she shook her head, and the teacher said, "I'm going to teach you how to read in English." So little clues and signs that kids can give you that will further your ability to provide an even deeper learning experience for them are always appreciated by people like me who work hard for English learners. These are a couple of professional resources, and I don't know if Jen can put these in the chat. There's an Arkansas ELL resource page from Coleraine, Colorado, which is an awesome website. And there's also another page in there that talks about guides to culturally responsive instruction for English learners. So if you've ever navigated the Coleraine, Colorado website, you'll know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, it's an amazing website. So thank you for participating tonight. And I think our moderator will probably open the floor if there are any questions.
Well, yes, you do have some questions. One says, I totally agree with you that students that are moving through the various levels quickly could be a sign of giftedness. But how do you get the ESL department data with the GT department and staff? It says, has your department developed any protocols that assist GT in identifying students that are moving through the levels quickly?
I think, I don't know that we have any firm protocols other than we talk to each other, and we work in the same building. One of the things that we did several years ago was to invest in an electronic database where we store all of our student data. So we have our student identification is in this one portal, along with their language proficiency scores, along with, and it interfaces with eSchool. So everything about that child moves into this portal. And we also recently imported our NWA assessment data. So today, for example, I was able to sit down in the data bank that I have and pull the numbers for the gifted kids, you know, because it's coming off of eSchool, which is where students are identified. So that's one layer of support and structure that we have. But conversationally, I can't say that we have formal conversations, but I think it's worth exploring in your own districts. Let's sit down and talk about this. Like, what instruments are you using to identify gifted students, and how are the ELs fitting into that process? And what are the barriers that are there? What are the biases that we're bringing to this process? What kind of assessments are we using? Are we using nonverbal assessments? Because that was a conversation we had many, many years ago before Jennifer's time with a former gifted supervisor. We had conversations around the tools we were using and trying to remove those biases so that students were not being asked to perform tasks that were heavily reliant on language. So they were, at that time, they adopted a lot of nonverbal assessments where students could do whatever the task was without having to rely on, I can't read the instructions, or I can't read what this task is. So I think that would be a starting place.
Okay. And this person also asked, do you have any issues about hesitancy of ESL parents to sign up or agree for their children to be in another school program? You know, so many programs, ESL, GT, so many labels, I guess. So.
I think if we communicate with the parent the benefits of our program, whatever that program is, and as long as we are communicating in a language that the parent understands. But here's the thing. We like a lot of paper. We like a lot of acronyms. We like to send stuff home. Here's a flyer about this. Here's a flyer about that. Well, the one thing that you also have to factor in is the parent's level of literacy. And if the parent is not highly literate, or you're sending all this information, even in print, in Spanish, or whatever the language is, in Vietnamese, in Maltese, or whatever, and nothing is coming back, you have to kind of go, okay, that's not working. So what do I need to do? You might need to pick up a phone with someone who speaks the parent's language and have a conversation. You might need to say, okay, that was the first conversation. Now let me see if I can get the parent to come to the school and I can explain in person what it is that I want to do for their student, with their student. So some of the traditional ways we want to communicate with parents are not necessarily the best way to reach a parent. And it can be frustrating. And you can say, well, I sent it home 10 times and it came back unsigned. Well, maybe the parent can't read. And if the parent can't read, the parent may not want to tell you, I can't read this. And I don't know what it means. I'm not literate. And that's a distinct possibility. So we have to start to think outside of the box. How can I communicate with this parent? And everything doesn't have to be in print. It just has to be communicated in a language the parent understands. So if you can access a bilingual person who can make a phone call on your behalf and you're on a 3-way call, make it happen. You'll never know. The parent might say, oh, that's what he kept bringing home and telling me, my teacher says you have to sign this. Parents aren't just going to sign a document they don't know what they're signing. And I always think of, if I moved to Germany and something came home and I couldn't read it because I don't read German, I'm not signing it. Just not.
Okay, that answered some of the other questions from the chat. They were saying that, the paperwork and time commitment and the stigma and unknowns, sometimes can be a hindrance, and how to overcome those. And I think what you just said, communicate possibly in their language so you can answer those questions for them so that they know
and I think, and something else I also want to say as a caution, and I've lived that experience myself, the things that we think, oh yeah, let's get on a Zoom with the parents. I can tell you, I promise, the level of technological literacy among some of our parents is extremely low. Even presuming that every parent has internet access is faulty logic. Every parent does not have internet access. Even assuming they've got it on their phone, faulty logic. Some parents have phones for the purpose of using a telephone. They do not have internet service on their phones. And some of it is attached to economic reality. I can't afford the internet. All I need is a phone that I can make phone calls on. So making the assumption is based on where we are. Don't assume just because everybody has a cell phone, everybody's got a phone, they can have a Cricket phone, they can have a Sprint, they can have a Verizon, they can have an AT&T. Well, some people have a phone for the purposes of a phone. So click the link and answer the bilingual survey if you want your child to participate in this or that. I can't click the link. I don't have the internet on my phone. And we're guilty. We all are, of pushing so much out now because we're in the wonderful world of Zooms and webinars and whatnots, and assuming that parents can jump right on in and get the LMS that your district is using because this is what we're doing. Well, we've worked with parents for whom there is not a high level of literacy, and I'm talking about technology literacy. So for many of our parents, we spend several minutes on the phone trying to explain what is a hyperlink for those who have the internet. What is a cursor? So just be mindful. Even though you're wanting to send all this home, it might mean that you have to make a phone call. That's a 3-way call. It might mean that, well, I've got 30 kids to reach. I don't have time for all that. Well, let's see how we can make this work. If we do, say we'll do a few phone calls tonight, we'll do a few the next night. Maybe we send a postcard to the house saying, I'm calling you on this day at this time, just so the parent knows, or a call will come from this number. Because that's another thing. Sometimes the parents will not answer the phone if they see a number and they think it's school and I don't speak English, and someone on that phone is going to expect me to respond. Simple things to say, okay, you're going to get a call from this number and somebody who speaks Spanish is going to be on the other end, or somebody who speaks Vietnamese is going to be on the other end, to help the parent understand, I'm calling you to tell you something. And document that you've called, and if you're allowed to document their permission to do the screening, document it that you did this via phone call, because the parents are not going to be able to get on a Zoom, and they're not going to be able to come to your school, or for whatever reason, for the time we're in, especially for the time we're in.
Okay, and this one's from Facebook.
Mhm.
It says, as part of our staff development one year, we took a bus to different areas of our district and passed out back to school information. It was a great way to see where our students live and to be in their neighborhoods and meet the adults in their lives. The students, they love to see them as well. So I think she was kind of just commenting on when you said, okay, go to the grocery store, buy from them, go and talk and, intermingle so that people can feel comfortable with each other. So that was
Absolutely.
what he shared.
Yes, that's wonderful. That's a lot. I've heard of that before where principal will get on a school, they'll get a bus from the school and drive the neighborhood and go see their kids. And I think, it's a wonderful piece to do because it shows to the community that you're reaching out and not always to come to us. That's how we traditionally think. We're having an open house, come on in. Well, maybe we should go on out.
Right. Okay. I'm looking and I don't see any more questions as of now. So we really appreciated you coming on and speaking to us about this. It opened my eyes. I know when you were talking about the criteria that you would look at instead of just high academic ability, that was very interesting. And I hope that we all take that to heart. Just that, if they're picking up easily on those things, then that could be a sign. So
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to this opportunity, Jennifer. Jennifer and I go back way back in time in knowing each other. And I certainly appreciate the opportunity to speak to gifted educators from different places. And I know that the work you do is commendable in the name of supporting students and supporting all learners to realize their highest potential. So once again, thank you for having me this evening.
all right, and you have a lot of thank yous in the chat from we have a lot of Northern Arkansas. We had Tim Smithy, North Little Rock on here. We have Little Rock on here. So a lot of people tuned in. Hot Springs, I see, is on here. So we really appreciate you coming tonight. And anytime you'd like to come back, please do.
Okay, you know where to find me, down the hall.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. And we'll have Dustin come back on and close us out.
Yeah, I'm here. I enjoyed it. Thank you, Dr. Henry. We really do appreciate it. It was fun reading the comments on Facebook and the questions being asked. So thank you very much. This is a very important and relevant topic for sure.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me, Dustin. Nice to meet you this evening. Take care.
Yeah. And thank you for everybody that joined us as well. Have a good evening.